Welcome to the debate. Today we are examining one of the foundational texts of the American system, the Declaration of Independence. The question isn't whether it's important. I think that much is obvious, but rather what is its true function today? Does the Declaration operate primarily as an aspirational, philosophical statement that sets an enduring moral standard for the nation? Or is its relevance, strictly tethered to its original historical and diplomatic purpose, holding no independent binding legal authority separate from the Constitution?
And that tension is absolutely central to how we understand American identity and law. We're really trying to determine if the Declaration is a living text that dictates political morality across generations, or if it's, well, the successful declaration of a political fact in 1776 that then cleared the path for the Constitution to define legal rights.
I maintain that the Declaration fundamentally functions as an aspirational manifesto. Its power is derived from defining that fundamental, ideal American commitment to liberty and equality, serving as the philosophical lodestar that the nation's laws must continuously strive to meet.
And my argument, however, is that the Declaration serves a purely historical and rhetorical purpose. Its initial, immediate goal was political, justifying a revolution and securing foreign alliances. It holds no binding legal authority independent of the Constitution. If you want legally actionable rights, you have to look to the governing charter that came after it.
My position really rests on the sublime power that's encapsulated in the preamble, the self-evident truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, while historians might note that the longest part of the document was the list of grievances, this philosophical intro, it captures the essence of the American ideal. It is the core creed, which is why it has been repeatedly invoked by every major movement seeking true constitutional change.
I absolutely recognize the compelling nature of that language, but recognizing history's political use of a document doesn't grant it legal authority at its genesis. The historical context, I think, demands we see the Declaration as fundamentally a political and diplomatic tool. Its immediate purpose was twofold: justifying breaking away from the crown to, the court of world opinion, and critically securing foreign recognition and military aid. France, for example, they wouldn't commit troops or resources, which led to the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, until the colonies proved that they weren't just engaged in an internal British civil dispute. The Declaration was that necessary diplomatic passport, which is why the lengthy list of grievances detailing King George III's repeated injuries and usurpations was so essential. It proved the separation was justifiable.
But those words transcended their immediate political utility, and they did so very quickly, becoming the central argument for the nation's very being. Think about the language of national dedication used by Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg. He referred back to 1776, establishing that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He was appealing not to the structure or specificity of the Constitution, but to the promise of the Declaration. And similarly, Martin Luther King Jr. famously described it as a promissory note for unalienable rights. These figures show that the commitment to equality captured in the preamble transformed the document into something much greater than a mere diplomatic announcement. It became the moral foundation upon which the Constitution rests.
And while those rhetorical invocations are undeniably powerful, they occurred decades, even centuries, after the document's adoption. My central point remains: the fundamental freedoms alluded to in the Declaration, they didn't become legally actionable until they were specified and enumerated in the Constitution in the Bill of Rights. The Declaration justified the need for a new government. The Constitution actually established that government and constrained its power, thereby guaranteeing the rights. So the Declaration offered the ideal, but the Constitution provided the mechanism.
But if it's merely rhetoric, as you argue, how do we explain its pervasive appearance in foundational court opinions? I think the line between moral foundation and legal foundation is, well, it's much blurrier than you suggest, especially when we consider how jurists use founding documents to interpret the Constitution.
So I guess I come at it from a different way. The Declaration is not cited as binding law. When legal arguments are built today, they cite the Constitution or statutes or common law precedents. If you look at court opinions, take Justice Thomas's concurrence in Adder and Constructors, for instance, the Declaration is used to articulate core national principles. aligning the interpretation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause with national sentiment. It provides context, yes, but the case never hinges on the Declaration itself. Its use is purely historical, rhetorical context, not a legal mandate.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Its rhetorical power, I think, demonstrates a core legal function in constitutional interpretation, particularly within what we call originalist frameworks. That is, the idea that we look at founding documents to understand the context and scope of the Constitution. I mean, consider Justice Field's powerful dissent in the post-Civil War slaughterhouse cases. He directly referenced the Declaration's language, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and explicitly equated those terms with the fundamental common law triad of life, liberty, and property, arguing that these are fundamental rights the government is bound to protect under the Due Process Clause.
But Justice Field was still ultimately interpreting the 14th Amendment. The Declaration's language provided the spirit, but the Constitution provided the rule that Field was attempting to define. The fact that he was in dissent also tells us something about the majority's unwillingness to grant the Declaration that kind of defining legal weight.
Perhaps, but by grounding his interpretation of due process in the Declaration, Field was using it to define the scope of fundamental constitutional rights for the next generation of legal thinkers. This shows jurists actively engaging with the Declaration as a source of American law's underlying philosophy, which is critical. And furthermore, on a strictly foundational level, the Declaration established the legal fact of independence in July 1776, a timing that was relevant in early historical cases like Shanks v. DuPont regarding citizenship. It wasn't just philosophy, it was a unilateral declaration of legal statehood.
Okay, we can agree it was a declaration of statehood, but let's look at the document's genesis to underscore its pragmatic political reality, the deliberate compromises made. The document's immediate goal was unification across the colonies to prosecute a war. This isn't just an edit. This is the core tension of 1776 being laid bare on paper.
You are referring to the deletion of the passage on slavery.
Precisely. Thomas Jefferson had written this strong passage attacking slavery, accusing King George III of waging a cruel war against human nature itself. This was removed. Why? Because delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, and even northern merchants involved in the slave trade, they objected. This removal shows that the immediate goal of political separation and colonial unification outweighed the high ideal of universal natural rights. They abandoned the highest principle when it conflicted with the immediate political objective of unity. The failure of idealism couldn't be clearer.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the compromise only reinforces the profound, revolutionary nature of the language that remained. I mean, if all men are created equal wasn't truly a threat to slavery, why did they feel compelled to remove the explicit slavery clause? The removal proves that the concept of universal natural rights was so potent, so fundamentally destabilizing to the institution of slavery, that it had to be suppressed.
But it was suppressed. That is the political reality of the document at the time of its signing.
Yes, but the document set an impossible-to-forget standard. The remaining language provided the raw material for future abolitionist and civil rights movements. The Declaration provided the philosophical yardstick, the new birth of freedom, as Lincoln called it, which necessitated the Civil War and the subsequent 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to be constitutionally vindicated. The Declaration, in this view, is the engine that drives legal change by holding the system accountable to its own initial, self-evident truth.
That shifts the focus dramatically away from the document's original intent and places it onto its later political reception. To underline its philosophical lineage, just consider the famous rights listed. Early colonial declarations and John Locke's recognized political philosophy, they use the triad, life, liberty, and property.
That is historically accurate, yeah.
Shift is crucial. By replacing a specific, established common law right, property, with a broader, more abstract political goal, happiness, Jefferson signaled that the Declaration was fundamentally defining political aspirations, rather than securing specific legal entitlements. This just further solidifies its non-legal status, relying on philosophy over definable enforcement mechanisms, in contrast to the Constitution, which later explicitly protected property rights through amendments.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Jefferson's pursuit of happiness was not a philosophical rejection of Locke or property, but more of a restatement intended to broaden the scope of liberty. He was drawing on precursors like George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which listed the inherent rights to the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety.
But Mason kept property distinct. Jefferson replaced it entirely.
Right, but the philosophical shift was meant to define the inherent natural rights that governments are created to secure, broadening the concept of liberty beyond just mere property holding and commerce. By stating these truths were self-evident and came from nature's God, the Declaration defined the moral ceiling of American governance, that these rights exist independently of and prior to any specific law. That is its function as a foundational moral law.
And those inherent rights, whether phrased as property or happiness, were alluded to in the Declaration, as one scholar put it, but they didn't become legally enforceable until they were enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration provided the ideals, but the Constitution ultimately provided the rule.
In the end, I maintain that the Declaration's self-evident truths establish the moral framework for American governance. It is the essential background, context, and philosophical lodestar that continuously pushes the legal and political system toward greater equality. It represents the perpetual, if often unfulfilled, promise of America.
And I would insist that the Constitution, which created an energetic government while also constraining it, remains the supreme legal authority. The Declaration's importance is undeniable, serving as a very effective political and diplomatic tool that outlines why the colonies separated. But it left the hard work of constitutional enforcement of rights, especially those promises vindicated by the post-Civil War amendments, to the subsequent document.
So we agree that the relationship between these two documents is symbiotic. The Declaration provides the moral direction, and the Constitution provides the legal structure for the journey.
Exactly. And the enduring tension between the Declaration's high ideals and the Constitution's specific legal mechanisms is what defines America's history. It really shows why examining the relationship between these two foundational texts is so critical for a full understanding of the United States.